Today we celebrate the feast of St. Mark, the evangelist. And we heard in the first reading, was chosen because in St. Peter makes reference at the end of his letter about how Mark was with him and sends greeting. And then we hear a little bit from the Gospel of Mark. And we remember a little bit about Mark, that he was a companion of St. Paul for a little while. He was a companion, he was actually a cousin or some sort of a relative of Barnabas. And Barnabas had gone out, and when he saw that Paul was preaching so well, he drew him in and said, okay, we need to work together. And so they went off, and on the first missionary journey that Paul went on through what's today Turkey, they brought with them Mark. But Mark, for whatever reason, left the company. Maybe he was feeling homesick, maybe he got a little sick physically, we don't exactly know, but he left. And then when Paul and Barnabas were getting ready to go on their second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to bring Mark, and St. Paul was like, nope, we're not bringing him, he deserted us, we're not taking him with us. Eventually, by the end of their lives, we do know that they worked out whatever issues they had between each other. St. Paul makes reference to Mark in one of his later letters. But we see in this that Mark wanted to get that second chance to be able to proclaim the gospel. Then eventually he became a companion of Peter, hence the first reading today. And when we talk about the Gospel of Mark, we talk about that it's the gospel actually of Peter, that it tells stories of Peter. As one of the people that I was listening to said, he said, if there's anything that's bad about Peter, you hear about it in Mark. And if there's anything that's good that's said about Peter, it's always immediately followed by something bad. Because Peter's not going to make himself look really good and say, oh, look how great I am. And so we see that there. Also, Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. And yet, even though it's the shortest of the Gospels and doesn't share as many of the stories and teachings of Jesus, in the stories that he does share, there's actually more detail than Matthew and Luke at times. There's more detail in those stories that he talks about. I think about, like, for instance, the multiplication of the loaves. Mark makes it clear that they go and they sit down on the green grass. A little bit of a detail that isn't necessarily told by the others, that the grass was green. Okay, not that you needed to know that, but it's not in the middle of winter when everything's brown, or the dry season. Okay, so we know it's in the spring. All this to say that Mark shares a certain perspective of who Jesus is. And we have to thank Almighty God that he shared this, that Peter shared this with Mark, and so Mark then felt the call to write it down. Because even if you don't go into all the details of what's the difference between Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and how they different, they each add a little bit of a glimpse, a different perspective on who Jesus is, how he affected people, what the call of the disciples then were. And we get to recognize also that God has a unique call for us, that each person that we meet, each of us, has a different facet of Almighty God, because we're all made in his image and likeness, and God is infinite, and so he has an infinite number of facets. And so when we look at each person made in the image of God, we see a different face of Almighty God, not because God is different, but rather because he is so infinite. We can see the glory of God in each person, sharing just a little bit of a different perspective of who God really is by our being. May we ask God for the eyes to see, that we may see his face in each person that we meet.